Now, the reason that you should be afraid of all this is because of the warnings we're getting from the only people who have even a little bit of an idea what's going on. This New Yorker story involves some of the civilian people who know what's going on, and I'll get to that in a minute. But some of the elected people who know what's going on are doing their darndest to warn us. What's interesting about that, too, is how often have we said on this program that we desperately need those people to act, right? What do we need to do to get those people to act? What's funny is they seem to be trying their best, the ones who care about this, to let us know enough information so that they can get our help acting. It's almost as if we're powerless and we're looking to them, and they're powerless and they're looking to us. The latest example of this happened the other day during testimony over the Patriot Act renewal. Oregon Senator, Democrat from Oregon, Ron Wyden, and Colorado Senator Udall got on the Senate floor, and Wyden made some statements that you need to pay attention to, folks. You need to understand how completely unprecedented what Wyden said is. Now, just so you know, it comes a year after similar, statements, although he went farther, that's why I call it unprecedented, similar statements by Senator Russ Feingold. All these people sit on the, very small Intelligence Committee. One of the misunderstandings many Americans have about their congresspeople or their senators is that those people are all in the know. They're not in the know. The only people who know the secrets that the government, employs and the things that they're doing, especially concerning things like the Patriot Act, are the people who sit on the Intelligence Committee. Now, people who sit on the Intelligence Committee are tried and true trusted members. They've been there for a while. They rarely change. They're the kind of people that the National Security Agency and the CIA and all those people can rely on to protect their secrets. These are insider people, right? These are not fly-off-the-cuff radicals. And yet, for more than a year now, several of them have been trying to warn us that we really need to understand what's going on. And they can't tell us. This is what Senator Ron Wyden said on the Senate floor the other day. I've been following politics for more than 30 years. I've never heard anyone get up there and say anything like this. He said, quote, "When the American people find out how their government has secretly interpreted the Patriot Act, they will be stunned and they will be angry. And they will be asking senators, did you know what this law actually permits? Why didn't you know before you voted on it? The fact is," Wyden said, "that anyone can read the plain text of the Patriot Act, and yet many members of Congress have no idea how the law is being secretly interpreted by the executive branch, because that interpretation is classified. Members of the public have no access to the executive branch's secret legal interpretations, so they have no idea what their government thinks this law means." He said, "While Americans recognize that government agencies will sometimes rely on secret sources and methods to collect intelligence information, Americans also expect that these agencies will operate at all times within the boundaries of publicly understood law." He says, "I've served on the Senate Intelligence Committee for 10 years, and I don't take a back seat to anyone when it comes to the importance of protecting genuinely sensitive sources and collection methods." He says, "But the law itself should never be secret. Voters have a need and a right to know what the law says and what their government thinks the text of the law means, so that they can then decide whether the law is appropriately written and ratify or reject decisions that their elected officials make on their behalf." He says, quote, "Government officials must not be allowed to fall into the trap of secretly reinterpreting the law in a way that creates a gap between what the public thinks the law says and what the government secretly claims that it says. When the public eventually finds out that government agencies have been rewriting surveillance laws in secret, the result is invariably a backlash and an erosion of public confidence in these governmental agencies." End quote. Wyden and Udall tried to insert an amendment to the Patriot Act renewal. The amendment would have required the government to, quote, "publicly disclose the United States government's official interpretation of the USA Patriot Act," end quote. The government argues that it can't do this because their interpretation of the Patriot Act is secret. Wyden ended the speech by saying that he believes that the people have a right to discuss this stuff and that there needs to be public debate over the trade-offs between freedom and security. Now, this harkens back to a similar effort by another member of the Intelligence Committee a year ago. former Senator Russ Feingold, when he was senator in 2010, made a similar plea to the people, trying to say as much as he could say without violating his own oaths of secrecy, to warn us that bad things are happening behind the scenes. He was talking specifically about a part of the Patriot Act called Section 215. Here's what he said in February 2010 on the floor of the U.S. Senate, quote, "Section 215 has been misused. I cannot elaborate, but I believe that the public deserves some information about this. I and others have also pressed the administration to declassify some basic information about the use of Section 215, and it has declined. We must find a way to have an open and honest debate about the nature of these governmental powers, while still protecting national security secrets, and under current conditions, that simply isn't possible." End quote. Folks, there comes a time with the question of secrecy where the whole thing begins to be like, a serpent devouring its own tail, where there becomes a feedback loop, where the very secrecy of everything prevents us from knowing how secret it is. We can't tell you how secret it is because it's a secret. And as I said, we might all feel much more comfortable with this if the general conception that Americans have that our senators and congressmen at least know what's happening was true, but they don't. The very few that are allowed some of this information, those on the Intelligence Committee, aren't allowed to tell us about it, but they're doing their best to do anything they can. Some of them. That's part of what was so depressing about this whole debate over the renewal of the Patriot Act and how the people who are pushing, as quickly as we can, we have to get it, taken care of ASAP or, more buildings will fall down, the way that they're treating people who question anything. And what it has done, in a wonderful way, is shown, I hope, Democrats out there that most of their, leaders are no different than the Republican leaders who did the same thing back when George W. Bush was pleading for this sort of speed in renewing things like the Patriot Act. Guys like Harry Reid slammed guys like Rand Paul for trying to at least, slow down and talk about this thing. Harry Reid basically said, he wants to help terrorists. Sounds like it's right out of the George W. Bush administration playbook, doesn't it? Salon columnist and liberal Glenn Greenwald wrote a piece recently about this since the Patriot Act was renewed, where he was slamming Democrats to high heaven for their hypocrisy on this. Here's what he wrote from the beginning of the piece. It's entitled, by the way, The Patriot Act and Bipartisanship. Quote, "Several days ago," he says, "I noted that Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell had agreed to a 4-year extension of the most controversial provisions of the Patriot Act, a bill Democrats everywhere once claimed to revile, without a single reform." He says, despite the long and documented history of its abuse, and despite Obama's previously claimed desire to reform it. He says, tonight a cloture vote was taken in the Senate on the 4-year extension, and it passed by a vote of 74-8. He says, the law that was once the symbolic shorthand for the evil Bush-Cheney post-9/11 radicalism just received a vote in favor of its 4-year, reform-free extension by a vote of 74-8. He says, only resolutions to support Israel command more lopsided majorities. He lists the 8 senators who voted against cloture: Independent Senator Bernie Sanders, Democrats Jeff Merkley, Mark Begich, Max Baucus, and John Tester, and GOP Senators Lisa Murkowski, Rand Paul, and Dean Heller. He says GOP Senator Mike Lee announced that he'd vote no, but missed the vote due to inclement weather. He goes, Senator Paul, along with Senator Tester, took the lead in speaking out against the excesses and abuse of the Patriot Act and the vital need for reforms. He says, quote, "But what's most notable isn't the vote itself, but the comments made afterwards." He says Senator Paul announced that he was considering using delaying tactics to hold up passage of the bill in order to extract some reforms. Paul's announcement of his delaying intentions provoked this fear-mongering, terrorism-exploiting, bullying threat from the Democrat Senate Intelligence Committee Chair Dianne Feinstein. Quote, "I think it would be a huge mistake," Feinstein told reporters, "if somebody wants to take on their shoulders not having provisions in place which are necessary to protect the United States at this time. That's a big, big weight to bear." End quote. By the way, Dan speaking now. That's nothing compared to the slam Harry Reid did, where he basically said that Rand Paul wanted to protect the rights of terrorists to get guns. But Greenwald continues, quote, "In other words, Paul and the other dissenting senators better give up their objections and submit to a quick Patriot Act passage, or else they'll have blood on their hands from the terrorist attack that they will cause." He says that, of course, was the classic Bush-Cheney tactic for years to pressure Democrats into supporting every civil liberties-destroying measure the Bush White House demanded. He says, and now we have the Democrats, ensconced in power, using it just as brazenly and shamelessly. He finishes the piece by saying, quote, "So when they were out of power, the Democrats reviled the Patriot Act and constantly complained about fear-mongering tactics and exploitation of the terrorist threat being used to stifle civil liberties and privacy concerns. Now that they're in power and a Democratic administration is arguing for extension of the Patriot Act, they use fear-mongering tactics and exploitation of the terrorist threat to stifle civil liberties and privacy concerns." End quote. Now, I was going to say some unabashedly good things about Rand Paul, the recently elected Republican senator from Kentucky, the son of Ron Paul, the congressman from Texas. And I'm a fan of Ron Paul, just like I'm a fan of Dennis Kucinich. Any one of these people who stands up for the Constitution on either side of the political spectrum gets my support. Rand is a much more frustrating guy to try to support because he'll do something that you favor and then he'll quickly turn around and do something you don't favor, like the other day when he said something about people who go to these political rallies. I mean, I don't even know how to phrase it. It was so contradictory to what you think a person with some sort of libertarian leanings would have. I couldn't even make sense of it. Basically saying something to the effect of, though, that your right to assemble should be very limited. That if you go listen to speeches by some radical, maybe you need to be investigated. But he deserves all of our praise for the way he stood up on the Patriot Act. And Harry Reid, Democratic, leader of the Senate from Nevada, slammed him down with what the Nixon administration would have called extreme prejudice.